Sometimes world events demand to be addressed even in the context of a Shabbat service. This is not one of those times. If it were, this would not be the event. And still, we need to talk about the Barbie and the Oppenheimer movies that are opening this weekend. Now, I haven't seen them yet. Since they opened today, you're here, so you probably haven't seen them either. But I want to talk about it, and it really isn't about the movies, but how their subjects are connected, and connected, I think, by a Jewish thread. So I should be clear, we don't need to talk about Barbie and Oppenheimer. If there were a world event deserving of commentary and piercing the sacred veil of Shabbos, it would be the ongoing political crisis in Israel. And as Rabbi Brown mentioned, she's going to speak about that tomorrow. Which means that at least for the next few minutes, I get to talk about what journalists and the internet have termed Barbenheimer. So let me open with a basic observation. Barbie, the doll, that no one thought was Jewish, was created by a Jewish woman. Oppenheimer, the physicist, who everyone saw as a communist Jew, wanted nothing to do with his Jewish roots. Both are extremely complex and polarizing characters who have shaped our social and cultural context while at the same time engendering tremendous public suspicion, loathing, and sometimes hatred. And if that sounds like a familiar description of how Jews are perceived and received in the world, well, we've only scratched the surface of their Yiddishkeit. So, Barbie. Barbie was created by Ruth Handler. Ruth was the daughter of Polish Jewish immigrants. Her husband, Izzy Handler, would later change his name to Elliot and briefly partner with Matt Matson to form the Mattel Corporation. Matt and Elliot gets you Mattel. Ruth and Elliot had 2 children, their daughter, Barbara. And do you want to guess their son's name? Yeah, Ken. Ruth observed that Barbara and her friends were playing with paper dolls and pretending to be adult women. And see, in the 1950s, the only dolls on the market were baby dolls, presuming that girls only wanted to be playing to be mothers. But Barbara and her friends wanted to play being adult women, with careers and houses and cars and dreams and independent identities. The Barbie doll that Ruth would create in response became a complicated and conflicted icon of feminism and assimilation, to say the least. Now, I'll get more into that in a moment, but on a purely halachic level, Barbie was the creation of 2 Jewish parents. She's Jewish. Much to the surprise, I am sure, of many who respond with the classic Jewish stereotype, she doesn't look Jewish. Oh yes, she does, says Ruth. And what does Jewish look like anyway? Might be our snappy and appropriate retort. Now, J. Robert Oppenheimer, the father of the atom bomb, was also born to 2 Jewish parents in 1904 in Manhattan, New York. Julius Oppenheimer and Ella Friedman. By the way, since names are so important here, anyone want to guess what the J in Robert Oppenheimer stands for? If you wrote Julius on your Jewish name bingo card, you win. Julius the senior and Ella never went to synagogue. They never gave their son, Julius Robert Oppenheimer, a bar mitzvah. And instead, they aligned themselves with the Ethical Cultural Society, which was an offshoot of Reform Judaism that rejected religious creed in favor of secular humanism and rationalism. The writer, Algis Valinus, observed, I'm quoting him here, the Ethical Cultural Society epitomized Jewish high bourgeois secular liberalism, concerned with the plight of the poor, guided by ideals of social justice, relentlessly hopeful, earnest, and progressive. The Ethical Cultural Society members promoted women's suffrage and the prohibition of alcohol and took part in the founding of the ACLU and the NAACP. And it was there that Robert developed an interest in universal moral tenets and a firm distance from his Jewish traditions. Yet much in the same way that many pre-war Jews gravitated towards utopian systems of governance, Oppenheimer found himself surrounded by like-minded people, most of whom also happened to be Jewish. He could not outrun his Jewish roots, and they followed him into his professional life. He was accepted to Cambridge after he did his undergrad degree at Harvard, but only accepted after one of his Harvard professors, in writing his letter of recommendation, wrote, "Oppenheimer is a Jew, but entirely without the usual qualifications." Thus, skirting the school's anti-Jewish quotas, Oppenheimer was accepted to Cambridge, but only because of that. The same prejudice followed him to Berkeley, where, while on faculty, he tried to secure a position for his colleague, Robert Serber, and was rebuffed by his department head, who said, "One Jew in the department is enough." Oppenheimer didn't push back on the decision, but later hired Serber to work on the Manhattan Project. And I'm told that the film doesn't address the internal struggle that Oppenheimer had with his Jewish identity, or address the overt anti-Semitism that followed him no matter how hard he tried to hide his Jewish roots. And according to one review of the movie that I read, quote, "In the film, characters repeat Oppenheimer's insistence that the J stands for nothing, rarely interrogating him on his Judaism. That he never encounters any overt anti-Semitism directed at him," according to this review. And then it went on to explain that the movie's version of Oppenheimer doesn't seem as tortured by his Jewish identity as he was in real life. And at several points in the film, actually, Oppenheimer bonds with other characters in his orbit over their Judaism and expresses anger at Hitler's treatment of German Jews. So, that's the background. This weekend, we have the iconic Barbie, the scorn of feminism for most of her 60 years, a white woman with blonde hair, blue eyes, and an unattainable, actually completely impossible figure. Gloria Steinem once said of Barbie, "She has everything we don't want to be." But had she been asked about her creator Ruth and her vision for what the doll could inspire girls, or how the doll could inspire girls, Steinem might have concluded that she was actually many of the things that women aspired to be, but were being denied. Barbie, created by a Jewish businesswoman for her Jewish daughter, was an independent working woman who was not defined by her husband. In fact, she didn't have one. The tagline for the movie is, "She's Barbie, he's just Ken." Starting in the 1960s, Barbie had a dream house, which had no kitchen. A credit card when women couldn't get credit cards. A car when often women were not driving them. And in one of her outfits, astronaut Barbie, Barbie would go to the moon 4 years before Neil Armstrong took one small step for mankind. When we really think about the values of inclusion, of equality, and even the Jewish diaspora struggle with assimilation, Barbie represents something much more than her looks, which is, of course, a central tenet of women's liberation. Barbie is a Jewish heroine of the likes of Esther and Ruth and Devorah and the matriarchs, to say nothing of Ginsburg, Steiner, Golda, Abzug, Sold, and Weil, and so many more. And again, if names are important, being known by just one is truly a sign of being iconic. Now, Oppenheimer is equally misunderstood, perhaps most misunderstood by himself. He spent his life distancing himself from Judaism and the Jewish community. Science was his code and his creed, and I know many Jews like them. But he was wrong to think that the two were incompatible. Look at me, calling the great Robert Oppenheimer wrong. But he was. Science and Judaism are immensely compatible. The medieval philosopher Maimonides clearly says that when given brains, that we are given brains and the ability to do rational thought. Judaism then is inherently compatible with the idea of using your brain to understand how the world works, which is what physics is all about, or so I'm told. I barely passed calculus. I'm actually not sure if I did. Physics can help us to see the beauty of the universe, and that beauty is part of what we are given as a responsibility to appreciate in Judaism as well. Now, Oppenheimer's life story is anything but Barbie dreamland. Motivated to create the bomb in part because of his realization that Jewish relatives of his were being murdered by the Nazis, he was later plagued by a conflicting sense of relief that American soldiers would be spared, and yet haunted by the mass death inflicted on America's enemies by the bombs that he created. And shortly after the end of the war, he finds himself again in a moral conflict, and this time it's with the U.S., because they were intending to create a hydrogen bomb. And this ultimately leads him to a demeaning hearing before the Atomic Energy Commission, where he is branded a communist and stripped of his security clearance before that commission. The man who led the charge against him was Louis Strauss, the chairman of the AEC, of the Atomic Energy Commission, and a past president for 10 years, no less, of Temple Emmanuel in New York City. Historian Jack Schlachter concluded that Oppenheimer's assimilated Jewish background and Strauss' strong attachment to Jewish affairs set them up for a conflict as men who represented two very different reactions to the pressures of acculturation and prejudice facing Jews in the mid-20th century. So, if Barbie is the outwardly atypical non-Jewish stereotype, and Oppenheimer is the stereotypical Jew of his own 2 or 3 opinions conflicting and arguing inside of him, internally conflicted and struggling like the rabbis of our rabbinic tradition struggle with moral complexities and contradictions of the human experience. If that's who they are, then in the end, both Barbie and Oppenheimer are complex and complicated characters. Both have done harm, undeniably so, but not to the exclusion of them having done good as well, and not to the exclusion of them operating in and through complex cultural moments. Oppenheimer embodied the age-old question of whether doing harm to lessen overall harm is, in the end, more good than bad. And Barbie has been beloved as well as reviled, and is associated with terrible misogyny and also with feminism. Maybe human, or doll, complexity is the singular message of both movies. It's certainly one of the underlying messages of Judaism. We are neither empty plastic vessels defined by our outward appearance, limited by society's prejudice and bias, nor are we purely algorithms of scientific calculation that see the world in only binary choices of black and white, good and evil. Barbie has dreams, and Oppenheimer had a soul, and both were obscured by how the world defined them. That, and their perseverance in the face of such prejudice, might have been the most Jewish thing about them both. Shabbat Shalom.